So, what age did both of you take up guitar?
11.
9 for me.
9.
Mm-hmm.
And at what age do you think you both came to the conclusion that this was a lifetime living?
10.
Before you started
Before I
playing?
started, yeah. Once I heard Hank Marvin playing Apache,
That was it?
I knew,
Yeah.
I knew that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Then it was about a year later that I got my first guitar.
Yeah. And Louie, when do you think it sort of became more than a hobby?
Well, I can't remember not being able to play because by the time I was 12, I was already fully employed as a guitar player. I was doing a radio show 5 days a week, a Saturday night jamboree, full-on jamboree, backing a lot of the artists, Grand Ole Opry style. And when TV first came out in Arkansas, the first station, we had a Wednesday night live-to-air TV show on that with this country band I was playing.
So you started country, playing country music?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, yeah. And, I was going back that far. I was there for the beginning of rock and roll, which as sort of a guitar player, I was like a sponge, really hungry to learn anything new that I heard. Up until that point, I'd only heard Chet Atkins and Jimmy Bryant, Merle Travis, and those kind of country guitar players being from Arkansas. And then, of course, when rock and roll came along and I started hearing, Chuck Berry and all of these guys, then I, started grabbing all of that stuff. At the same time, I had just heard about Barney Kessel and Wes Montgomery and Johnny Smith. And so...
For me, it was Charlie Bird.
Charlie Bird.
Yeah, that whole samba thing, that whole jazz sound with Stan Getz and Charlie. When I heard Charlie playing that finger style nylon. And then I got into flamenco.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know you.
Yeah, when I was 16, I was sure I was going to be the next Carlos Montoya, Pepe Romero, whoever they were.
Carlos Montoya from Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. But then I heard James Taylor.
Yeah.
Playing that same finger style but on a steel string, and that's when I thought,
it's amazing the number of people that cite James Taylor, isn't it, as an influence?
Yeah.
Incredible.
That incredible orchestrated thing he was doing.
Well, speaking of the rock and roll, the early days of rock and roll, I have film. Sam's going to hate me for this. I have film of Sam. He's about 2. He's still in nappies, and he had a ukulele that I'd put a strap on for him, and he's. We've got a video on the TV of the Elvis Presley 1968 comeback special.
Oh yes. And
there's Sam emulating Elvis doing All Shook Up with all the moves, down on one knee, the whole thing. So I look back at those early films, and it should have been obvious at the time, but it wasn't. That even then he was playing.
Not much has changed, except for the nappy.
Oh, right.
You've given that up.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah. So if you had to name one major influence in your career, it's difficult to do for guys like yourself, but if you had to say that one big guitar playing influence, who would it be?
Well, they kind of change over the years, don't they? Yeah. I mean, as I say, for a long time it was Charlie Bird when I was in my early teens, which is very weird. I mean, I was living in Europe at the time. Yeah. So I was up kind of on my own over there in Belgium, listening to this stuff. But then I guess James Taylor for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And then I heard Ry Cooder and Lowell George and those guys playing the slide, and that's when I thought,
I like that.
I really want to get into that slide thing. Yeah.
And Louie, if you had difficult one, but if you had to say, a pivotal player,
Probably Chet Atkins, because across the breadth of the recordings that he did, there were all kinds of music which made me learned to use all my fingers because he was doing classical music and a lot of the all of that stuff became useful later on when I got in the studio because if you look back at the days when we were doing people like Mamas and Papas and those kind of things, there was always a request, okay, well, could someone play fingerstyle guitar on this one? You'd have the guy playing the rhythm, and then you... So because I learned to use my fingers through the Chet Atkins influence, that stuff really came easy to me because most of the players had just picked up the guitar doing the folk era and they did finger stuff, but to get all the way through a tune without making a mistake and someone stopping the recording, say, oh, I heard someone buzz the fret over there. You know, I didn't have that problem because I had the technique that probably, you know, I'd have to give credit to Chet. But it's almost equal amounts to other people, like, because when I became aware of Barney Kessel and got my first record of his, all of a sudden, I'm starting to hear standards where we're using more chords and major sevenths, which we never used in country music.
Yeah.
So I learned my jazz chords all of a sudden from those guys, and then the Johnny Smith, which he was such not only such a great chord player, but his single lines and the way getting up and down the necks. I picked up so much of that from him. And, you know, equal amounts of influence as soon as I started hearing, you know, Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck. I was equally as interested in what they were doing. Even though I had grown up with traditional blues and bought my first B.B. King record for 99 cents in 1958 at the supermarket, and got his licks down, what the English guys were doing with it by taking it further and using it in the ways they did was a great breakthrough. And I never was one to just get to a certain place and say, okay, I know everything I'm going to learn. I'm not going to learn anymore. I always was open to exploring anything new that I heard, which obviously that invasion of all of those groups was something that I embraced. And that way, when I got into the studio, if someone wanted me to do a George Harrison sound or a Jimmy Page, at least I had some inkling of the sound and their thinking process and the whole thing.
So
I could go right to it.
a lot of that, the early, speaking of blues, the rural blues, the Robert Johnson, Big Bill Broonzy, all of that stuff, the English players kind of introduced that back to the States, didn't they? Is it something that, when you were growing up, was really that early rural sort of blues stuff had been largely forgotten at that point?
You know, there was a select few of us that really loved it.
Yeah.
And we would share new stuff that we had heard with each other.
Yeah.
It wasn't like something you heard a lot on Top 40 radio at all. It was more of an underground thing that we embraced. So I became familiar with guys like Little Willie John and those guys, and learned their tunes.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something that was widely commercial.
And you probably got exposed to a fair bit of that actually in Europe, did you?
Not really, no.
Not so much, no?
No, then I moved back to Canada, and
Yeah.
Canada in the mid-60s was kind of the Beatles, you know. I mean, that's when the Beatles came along and the Rolling Stones. But no, I never, all that early blues stuff, I didn't hear for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And I must say, when I did, I thought, oh boy, that's kind of scratchy and out of tune. And, you know, oblivious to the fact that these people invented it. You know?
Yeah.
I was kind of listening to the, you know, the actual intonation and all those things.
Well, and unfortunately, in fact, we're going back to when there was so much segregation. Those players, they played the black, blue, real, you know, guys we're talking about.
Yeah.
They played in places where it was segregated.
Yeah. The Chitlin circuit.
Yeah, and even the radio was segregated to a large degree. Luckily, we did have all black radio stations that we could listen to. And my family was so diverse in their listening pleasure that often my mom would have it on a black radio station, and just by chance, you know, she liked that, and so did I. So we were pretty happy that way.
I also I grew up in Venezuela and Cuba too before we moved to Belgium. So my mother was a big fan of the music of the country she was living in at the time. So I kind of had this surge of Latin American music all the time. You know? So I have an odd background. That's probably why I like the bossa nova when I first started hearing Charlie Bird playing that stuff, because I was already kind of familiar with those feels and those rhythms. You know?
But when I left Little Rock, the first place I went to for a long time was Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this is in 1958. And Santa Fe was a very small Mexican town, and the music there was pretty much Latin. And the gigs that I got for a while was playing jazz standards and Latin. And so I was able to learn all of those tunes and play that style. But even there, eventually, I got approached to put together a rock and roll band. And so here we go. Started my first rock and roll band in Santa Fe.
Yeah, I bet that was something in 1958.
It was, it was. Some guy came and built a brand new club there and allowed me to have a four-piece band rather than a trio. Had drums, organ, sax, bass, and guitar. So it was a great band.